Banged my head, I think. Well, it's truly a very great pleasure to have Professor John Clague as our guest speaker this evening. Professor Clague has made important contributions to our understanding of things like earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, and floods during his career at SFU. And he's received many honors for his work, including the Order of Canada. Tonight, floods are his topic, in particular, the disastrous flood of last November. And I know it's really hard to think of floods during this time of severe drought, as we were just discussing. But this talk this evening will make the memories come flooding back to us. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Clague. Thanks very much, John, for being so generous with your time and coming to speak with us again.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I've got to get my presentation up here, but it's definitely a pleasure to speak to the Burke Mountain naturalists. Let's see here. Share. What I got to do. Okay. Let me get. My usual on here. Slideshow. Do you see the full screen now, Victoria?
Not yet.
Okay.
No, can still see, yeah, you're not full screen.
There.
Now you are, yes.
Great. Thank you very much. It's the little hiccups. It still beset me when I'm giving talks electronically, but I'm very happy to have this opportunity. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. I think we all learned a lot of lessons from this. I would call it a catastrophe, at least from the economic impact that it had, and got me to thinking about floods more generally in British Columbia. So I'm going to introduce my presentation by talking a little bit about floods in the context of natural hazards in BC. And the government at one time told us we live in the most beautiful country, most beautiful province in Canada and the most beautiful place in the world. And I'm not sure I would be quite that superlative, having visited a lot of other beautiful landscapes, but we are very blessed to have such a wonderful home in which to live and travel. British Columbia has so much diversity, geological diversity, topography. We have mountains, glacier-clad mountains. We have river valleys, countless lakes, and at our doorstep, we have the North Pacific Ocean, which provides the climate contrast that we have in this province. And aside from the physical aspects of the province, we have such wonderful ecological diversity too, such a wide variety of plants and animals and the ecosystems that support them. And so I appreciate all that. I feel very, very fortunate to live in such a beautiful place. But there's a flip side to all that, and that comes with a little bit of a price, not too onerous, but we are subject to natural hazards. And we get pretty much all of them with the possible exception of tornadoes. And I'm beginning to wonder about that because there was a small tornado that came on shore at UBC last year, very small and didn't cause any damage. But otherwise, we have severe storms, lots of landslides in our mountainous terrain, and we have earthquakes. We've been very fortunate that we haven't had a damaging earthquake in Vancouver, but I fully expect that we will at some time in the future. Unknown when, but we probably will. And then floods. And floods are the topic that I'm going to address tonight in the group of hazards that I study. And I think it's interesting to think about why we're at risk from floods. One of the reasons is that almost all of us live adjacent to water. First of all, a large population, large part of the population lives adjacent to rivers, and we always have. Going back 11 or 12,000 years, indigenous people live along rivers, that supported them. Others live along lakes, the water body, or along the shores of the Pacific. And given this and the fact that really our history is anchored in rivers that ended up kind of leading to or allowing communities and ultimately cities to develop, it's not surprising that we are exposed to flood hazard. We all live in valleys. There are rivers in those valleys. It's not rocket science, but we are exposed to floods. And so that's the topic that I want to address. And I like to kind of package it by saying, well, not all floods are the same. We have different types of floods. That gets a bit academic, but it comes into play when I switch over to the discussion of atmospheric rivers. But first, I would like to just generally put that in some context. So one way to do that is to look at the size of the watershed in which floods occur. And I'd like to start by just targeting the largest watershed in British Columbia, which is the Fraser River watershed. It is huge. It's 1/4 of the province, 226,000 square kilometers. There are many countries that are not that big, including Switzerland. And given its size, it is subject to a certain type of flood. And these are seasonal floods that happen typically in late May or June. And they only arise if certain conditions are a certain kind of setup is in play. And typically we don't get large floods on the lower Fraser River unless we have large winter and spring snowpacks. So one way you can kind of get a hint as to whether it's possible to have a flood like the 1948 flood, which I'll talk about in a moment, is whether we have exceptional snowpacks. And it's necessary because we're essentially creating the captured water over a very, very large area. Basically the mountains of all southern British Columbia. They're charged with solid H2O that can be delivered to streams and rivers and ultimately to the main stem of the Fraser very, very abruptly and quickly. A second condition is that we have to have a delayed onset of summer. So we have a cool spring that persists until May often, and then kind of the light switch changes and we get very summer-like conditions superposed on that heavy snowpack. And when that happens, of course, you melt a lot of snow very quickly, and all that water comes down into the valleys. And in extreme situations, the rivers, the tributaries, and the main stem cannot handle it, and they overtop their banks, and we have flood conditions. In the case of the 1894 and the 1948 floods, which are the two largest floods that British Columbia has experienced historically, there was also warm rain on snow during this period when the temperatures rose very rapidly. And you just end up with so much water that the streams cannot convey it to the Strait of Georgia. So that's the kind of the setup for flooding in, say, Metro Vancouver in the Fraser Valley. You have to have those kind of, at least two of those conditions as a prelude to conditions that arise in May and June. I'm going to return to the medium-sized watersheds in a moment, but this is the Fraser River watershed. And as you all are aware, it really taps a large part of southern British Columbia, almost all of it, but the Columbia River is also significant. And rivers that flow off the Coast Mountains to the west are independent of the Fraser River. catchment. And so we don't know very much about this flood. It is the flood of record, the largest flood on the Fraser River that we're aware of, that's reported in the very short history of British Columbia. But there are photographs, and it's estimated that it was the largest flood that we've seen on the lower Fraser River. And this is just a photograph of Chilliwack, a historical photo taken in 1894 of Chilliwack, the town that was inundated with water. The second largest flood and a much more damaging flood was the 1948 Fraser River flood. And these are interesting photographs. The one on the left, on my left, shows Chilliwack and the Sumas Prairie area in the background, Mount Baker in the distance. And it's interesting that during this flood, a part of Sumas Prairie was inundated by the Fraser River. And I'm going to return to the Sumas Prairie situation a little later on in the talk. And this area around Hatzick Prairie, Mission was totally inundated when the protective dikes at the time, which really were not adequate to the job, failed and water escaped onto the floodplain of the river in many, many places from this area all the way downstream, almost to New Westminster, and possibly the Fraser Delta plain was impacted. It's not clear. There's no direct evidence of that I'm aware of, but it likely did experience, kind of the Delta plain got wet. And I love this photograph. And unfortunately, this barn does not exist anymore. But this is a photograph of a barn on Hatzick Prairie, adjacent to the Fraser River, and it shows the flood levels over the past century up to sometime after 1948, when the barn was torn down. But you can see the levels of the two largest floods. 1948 is kind of scribbled on that barn in black letters to the right of the rod there. And 1894 is the one at the top. But it's interesting that, these aren't the only two times that the Fraser River has escaped its channel. There have been recurrent floods, typically in this May-June period, going back more than 100 years, and there have been many of them. After 1948, the whole diking system along the lower Fraser was improved, and it has protected people and property up to the present, although we came close in 1972 to having the Fraser River flood in developed areas below Hope. And so it's relatively straightforward to come up with a risk analysis using these historical data, estimates of peak river flow as a function of time. This is called a frequency magnitude diagram, and it's used for a variety of hazardous processes, earthquakes being another. Typically, the largest events, whether they be earthquakes or floods, are rare, as you might expect. The 48 flood has a return period, if you look at where it plots on the horizontal line, of about 100 years. We would expect, a discharge of the magnitude of the 1948 flood about once every 100 years. And I mentioned 1972. That was a large discharge, quite a bit lower than the 1948 discharge. And because the diking system had been improved, it didn't result in any damage in the Fraser Valley. But this is one way that kind of managers kind of deal with estimating what property might be at risk as to how often a flood of a particular size occurs. So I'm going to switch gears now. I'm going to come down to smaller size watersheds. And you can get the same setup in a smaller watershed that you do for the Fraser River watershed. You can still get heavy snowpacks and late onset of summer conditions, which produce floods. But there's another type of driver for flooding when you're dealing with these medium and small size watersheds. And those are what we call atmospheric rivers. They used to be called pineapple expresses. I don't think the meteorologists particularly like that term. Both pineapple express and atmospheric river are evocative, to me. They're not super technical terms, and they really describe the nature of the beast. And the first thing I would point out is that these rivers in the atmosphere, water vapor rivers, are very common. They occur in many parts of the world, and they're driven by the tracking of warm, moist masses of air on into higher latitudes, and where they can possibly reach land and produce precipitation that is unprecedented, that we wouldn't normally expect to receive. And of course, this is a great illustration here because it shows the path that an atmospheric river might take from lower latitudes, the subtropics, up onto the mid latitudes, from California all the way to Southeast Alaska. These bands of moisture are more than 1,000 kilometers long, typically about 100 kilometers, 50 to 100 kilometers wide. And it depends upon where they strike the coast as to how they deliver that moisture. So it's interesting that there's been an awful lot of work done on atmospheric rivers. And we know that the setup is unlike the snow melt rainfall setup. These occur typically in the fall and winter on our coast. And these are the paths that the atmospheric rivers in the fall and winter of 2019-20 took along the US coast, and it extends up to our part of the world, but this is I think it's a NASA product, and they don't actually include Canada. But you can see that atmospheric rivers of different paths and different sizes really kind of can strike any part of that coast, including areas all the way up to the Alaska Panhandle. And another interesting thing here is that sort of like hurricanes, there is now atmospheric river scale that indicates the kind of the strength of the storm that arises when these track onto land. And so you can see some of those, the ones in blue are weak or moderate in the case of the orange ones. Very few are actually what would be called strong. And by strong, it means there's a certain amount of moisture that's delivered in a certain period of time. It's just a way of capturing the size of these things. So in the case of California, these are positive things. I mean, they can, if they're strong enough, produce damage. But California, I grew up in San Diego, California, it received most of its rainfall, a paltry 15 centimeters, I think, due to fall and winter atmospheric rivers. And so in a Mediterranean climate like that, this is the important source of moisture that supports populations of, well, in the case of California, 40 million people. So they're important, and they're not all negative. But unfortunately, when you get an exceptional one, like we received last November, they're more damaging than helpful. And I would say that it's kind of a yin and yang or mixed blessing, because a lot of the moisture we receive is also provided by atmospheric rivers. I wouldn't say we would necessarily want to have one right now, even though we've been in a state of drought. We're going to be experiencing rainfall, but it's not going to be atmospheric river conditions. It's just going to be the normal cyclonic storms that arise in the Gulf of Alaska and track onto our coast from the north. But anyway, these are kind of different. They're different. They produce floods at a different time of the year than the large watershed snowmelt floods. And an example of one, I don't know how well you remember this, but back in 2003 in October, there was an atmospheric river that tracked just north of Vancouver and produced severe flooding in Pemberton and almost breached the dikes at Squamish. And this was a consequence of very warm, moist air tracking over an early fall snowpack in the southern coast mountains and just producing a ridiculous amount of runoff that the Lillooet River and the Squamish River could not handle. And it's interesting because the Lillooet River and the Squamish River are examples of rivers that can have floods at 2 times of the year. So they can have a atmospheric river event in the fall, or they can have your normal freshet snowmelt event in the late spring or early summer. So now I'm going to turn really to the more the focus of this talk, which is arguably Canada, I think it is Canada's most costly natural disaster, far exceeded, say, the ice storm in southern Quebec and southern Ontario in 1998, or any of the Red River floods in Manitoba. The damages are sort of up there in the stratosphere, you know, $7.5 billion, which is a point I'm going to return to later in terms of ensuring that our infrastructure is prepared for these. But it tracked right onto our coast. It was an exceptional event. It's actually 2 kind of pulses that came onto the coast of southern Vancouver Island and tracked right through the Fraser Valley in mid-November of 2021. So almost a year ago. To me, it's remarkable. And you can see the setup that drives this. The air is drawn up along this anti-clockwise cyclone that is strongly developed over the Gulf of Alaska. And it basically, well, it sucks up this moist stream of air onto the coast. And it was kind of the circulation pattern was such that it tracked right onto our coast rather than, say, California or Alaska. And as a result, we got very large amounts of precipitation. I remember thinking, well, this isn't just a normal fall rainstorm, because it really, the intensity of the rainfall was something I hadn't really seen for periods of hours. And it also was exacerbated by the fact that you had 2 pulses, and they ultimately stalled over the eastern Fraser Valley, over the Chilliwack Hope area. And as a result, they kind of continued to dump large amounts of rain over this very large area. And basically our streams were unable to handle that. And it showcased the weaknesses in our infrastructure, because every highway into Vancouver, with the exception of the route in 99 from Washington to the north, were severed or broken by either landslides or by erosion from the floodwaters. So Highway 99, Highway 1, the Trans-Canada, Coquihalla, as you're aware of, briefly Highway 3, well, it didn't really get back into service for a week. And so we were pretty well isolated. It was kind of a scary situation for a lot of people, and even worse, it was very damaging for a large number of people as well. So I'm going to show you a few slides that show the impact of that. And this is Highway 7 east of Mission, one of the places where the highway was blocked, and it was blocked farther to the east, such that there were about 300 people who were trapped in cars on the highway and couldn't get out. And basically they spent 2 to 3 days inside their vehicles, typically without food or water, before they were rescued. Very, very scary for them. And there's a learning lesson in this photo. This was triggered by a landslide, so it wasn't entirely a flood. You can see all the debris that was brought down on the highway. But look at the amount of woody debris. I mean, these storms typically produce floods that transport large amounts of coarse woody debris, which make it more difficult to remove when the storm is over, and pose a direct threat because those stems that those guys are standing on or near are battering rams. So there was a debris flow that I'll show you in a moment that actually killed 5 people on Highway 99, and probably the loss of life stemmed in large part from the tree stems that knocked the vehicles they were in off the highway and down the slope. So there's something to be learned from that, as we've got to manage our forests better than we have in the past. And the Coquihalla Highway, of course, was the poster child for damage in this event, suffered major damage. I went through there about 2 weeks ago, and they're still working on repairing the handful of places that were severed by the floodwaters. And part of the problem was, even though the Coquihalla Highway is one of our newer highways, it was built in 1985, the footings were not appropriate for the discharges that the Coquihalla River carried or the Coldwater River carried. They were kind of spread footings as opposed to pilings, and you can basically takes a lot of damage before a bridge supported by pilings will collapse. So you can see the spread footing adjacent to the bank that was undercut that collapsed down the bank, and probably in hindsight wasn't too surprising. And when I saw this photo, it blew me away. If you've driven up the Nicola River Valley on Highway 8, you would be driving along the Nicola River between Spence's Bridge and Merritt, and there was a highway there. You can see a patch of it in the left center of that image. The rest of it totally gone. And basically there's no evidence aside from that little patch that there was a highway there. And the reason is that the river was going berserk. It had such high discharge. This is well after the event, so the river's dropped and some snow has fallen. But you can kind of get the impression as to how that river on that convex bend undercut the slope. It drove it back probably 5 to 10 meters. And the highway, of course, was seated on fill in those erodible sediments, and there was no contest between the river and the highway, even though there was riprap, I believe, supposedly protecting the highway from erosion. And this is a photograph of Merritt at the peak of the flood. And one thing that caught my attention was that Merritt sits at the junction of 2 rivers, the Nicola River near the bottom of the photo and the Coldwater River in the upper right. And I wondered if that wasn't a contributor to the severity of the flooding in Merritt, because you're basically got 2 fire hoses that are coming together. And it's not just a single river that's passing through your community, it's 2 that join together at the downstream end and potentially exacerbate the flooding because they're both running wild. And so I got to thinking, well, is this more common pattern than just the case of Merritt in the upper right? It came to my attention that the same situation exists in Kamloops, perhaps even a stronger situation, because you've got the North Thompson and the South Thompson River joining right in the downtown area of Kamloops. And in 1972, during that high Fraser River flood, the Thompson River was also running high, and there was flooding within the area of North Kamloops to the kind of towards the upper left of that photo where the airport is. And I think that area, I hesitate to say this, but I think that area is still vulnerable to flooding. There are no dams on the Thompson River, thank goodness, but there are possible issues with protecting these low-lying areas, both in downtown Kamloops and on the north shore of the Thompson River. And if you go to Kamloops, the park in downtown, I don't have the slide in this presentation, but the park has an obelisk that shows the levels reached by the 1948 flood, the 1972 flood, and another flood, I think in 1991. And it turned out that Kamloops, although it was sparsely populated at the time, was impacted in 1972 and in 1948. So there's a fairly high flood risk there. The other area where two rivers come together is Prince George. In a natural state, that would be pretty vulnerable to flooding because the Nechako River and the Fraser River are two big rivers. But the Nechako River is now kind of regulated. There are dams that control the flow on the Nechako. So it's probably an okay situation for that reason. Although ice can build up at the junction there and has in the past, and you get what are called ice jam floods, where water kind of rises behind plugs of ice and then inundates low-lying areas. This became an issue for the industrial area adjacent to the Nechako River some time ago. I can't quite remember. I think it was about 20 years ago. And then I mentioned briefly that high precipitation did trigger a number of debris flows. And I think the only fatalities during the atmospheric river disaster were at this site along Highway 99, where kind of a insignificant little failure occurred along the old deactivated forestry road that you can see at the top of that arrow. And it wasn't properly deactivated. So water ran down the road without proper drainage for it to go down the slope, and just ran over the slope and triggered a fairly small failure, we think, based on the size of the source area. But that bulked up as it moved down that steep slope and picked up trees. And so here you see another example where there's a lot of tree stems mixed in with boulders, gravel, and mud that just dislodged vehicles and pushed them over the edge of the road to the left of those people that are trying to deal with the aftermath. And then finally, the last thing I want to touch on in terms of impacts is Sumas Prairie. This is also near and dear to my part because Sumas Prairie at one time did support a lake. It was called Sumas Lake, and the Stolo people valued this lake. It was a pristine, wonderful waterfowl area. There were lots of food resources for people. And that lake was drained in the colonization period back in around 1930 to create farmland on the prairie. And so the natural state of that kind of flat area is a wet state. And we know that from the existence over a long period of time of Sumas Lake. And so it kind of struck me, well, wouldn't it be obvious that that lake could get established again if one of the rivers bordering it were to overtop its bank and spill into the prairie? And we saw that that happened in 1948 during the Fraser River flood. But it's not just the Fraser River. This is Action Central for flooding, because you've got the you've got the Chilliwack River coming in on the right there, and it's conveyed into the Fraser by a drainage canal called the Vetter Canal. And then to the south, you've got a real bad actor. It's the Nooksack River, which flows off Mount Baker, which is a glacier and snow-clad volcano. And it can spill over a very low divide near the border between Washington and BC and flood the prairie. And to deal with that, BC created a drainage canal called the Sumas Canal, which you can see at the left side of the flooded prairie there, to convey Nooksack River water that might spill over the divide into the Fraser River at the top, just beyond the top of that image. Well, unfortunately, just too much water came across the border and it overtopped the Sumas Canal dikes and breached them in 2 places. And before you knew it, the whole prairie was underwater. And I should say that this is a very flat surface, and remarkably, it's only in places a few meters above sea level. It's almost like a closed depression. And, the fact that this could happen was recognized, and the government sort of didn't take action to improve the engineered structures that protect property on the prairie. The result was 1,100 homes were flooded, lots of life of animals, and probably roughly $1 billion of damage. In my mind, inexcusable. The governments of all political colors just dropped the ball in terms of not dealing with a problem that arguably was imminent. It's going to happen. It's just a question of when. So I was really, really annoyed by that. And of course, this was the reason that one of the reasons that this had such huge impact. It wasn't just the floods kind of disrupting our highway system and our rail lines. Well, it was that, breaching them, but it also had cascading or spilling down effects in terms of economic impacts, in that shipments to and from the Port of Vancouver were completely disrupted for quite a long time. So when you think about it, Delta Port, for example, is the largest export facility, bulk export facility in the country. And when you basically prevent export of materials, containers, coal, whatever, from Vancouver to Asia, the cost of that becomes astronomical in a very short period of time. And so there were a lot of vessels that were in transit at the time, waiting in the Southern Salish Sea to unload cargo at the port. And many of them returned to Asia with empty containers because there wasn't space in which to temporarily store this very large number of containers. And so there was this huge kind of secondary cascading economic impact of the event. And if I can just step back one slide, the Trans-Canada Highway was blocked for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks because it crosses Sumas Prairie and it was underwater. As Sumas Prairie was underwater, so was our national highway. So I'm just going to close with some comments on flood risk. And, in spite of the fact that we know a lot more about floods, and we're probably in a better position to react to them when they happen, and even to forecast some of the larger ones, I would say that the risk, the vulnerability that we face in BC has increased. And the main reason for that is, of course, our population has grown very rapidly. If you look at this diagram, it basically parses out the urban population from the rural population. You can see how much our cities have grown. In 1948, the total population of British Columbia was under 1 million people. It's 5 times that now. And so inevitably, those people are finding their homes near water of one sort or another. And the overall exposure of the population, maybe not an individual, but the overall exposure of the population has increased. So the societal collective is facing with a greater risk than it ever has. And that risk fundamentally increases every year because there's no way we're going to basically live outside these valleys, mountains, where you might not have to worry about floods, but you got to worry about landslides, something like that. And the other factor that's coming into play is we've transformed our landscape over the past 100 years. Arguably, it's no longer a natural landscape, and wildfires and clear cutting have contributed to that. Wildfires create situations where the forest canopy cannot intercept rain, and so you get more rapid runoff. And this is made worse by the fact that very severe fires create a hydrophobic effect, essentially a thin layer that operates like a plastic sheet in the shallow depths below the forest soil that prevent or reduce infiltration of rainwater. So in heavily burned areas, rain runs off more rapidly and results in streams reaching higher flood levels more quickly than would otherwise be the case. And we've also seen that we've had an increase in areas burned and probably in the severity of very bad fires during our drought years of the last decade or so. So over the, you remember probably the summer of 2017, it was a terrible year. It was, I think, probably the worst fire year we've had. But last year in the heat dome or after the heat dome, we basically experienced similar conditions that resulted in the government having to spend over $500 million fighting fires. I mean, that provides employment, but it also is a tremendous economic toll on you and me as taxpayers. So we worry about this in the context of climate change, and that drought conditions are likely to increase. All the modeling tells us that that is going to be the case. We certainly kind of get hints of that this year, when with lack of rain in late summer and right up to the present. It's kind of something we need to worry about and deal with. And then industrial scale logging may be a culprit as well. Clearly, I've looked at the stats, and logging doesn't impact in any given year anywhere near the amount of land, forest lands that wildfires do. But collectively, year after year after year, you can basically remove forest over a very large area of the land. And this is an example that shows clear cuts in an area west of Okanagan Lake between the Fraser Canyon and Okanagan Lake. And that's a product of probably 40 or 50 years of industrial scale deforestation. And it doesn't produce this hydrophobic effect, but it does, of course, reduce the amount of vegetation that can intercept rainfall and kind of diminish the peak flows that you get during floods. So I think these two factors, the fact that we've changed our landscape, are actually making flooding more severe and worse when those conditions arise naturally. And then climate change, as I've hinted, is kind of implicated in this as well, because a warmer climate has many adverse effects. It typically leads to drought during continental areas, maybe not necessarily along the coast, although I'm beginning to wonder about that. But certainly high heat as we experienced last June. And it also increases the intensity of storms too. Essentially the atmosphere being warmer can hold more moisture, and it's also getting atmospheric circulation on the largest scale. When you think about the jet stream, is beginning, I use the word sloppy, because there's a reduction in the differential between the temperature in the Arctic, which is warming faster than anywhere else, and the North Pacific Ocean. The Gulf Stream doesn't know where it belongs, and it kind of moves all over the place, and you get these kind of storms occurring in places where you haven't seen them typically in the past. And I call your attention to what's happening in Nigeria right now. Hundreds of people have died in the most incredible floods that they've ever experienced. Earlier this year, we had the worst flooding in Pakistan in its history. And so the atmosphere is kind of fighting us. in many ways. And I think we have to worry about extreme events as much as, kind of the fact that climate warms a bit. It's that warming is kind of leading to events that are naturally quite rare. I wouldn't say they never occur, but they're quite rare, becoming more common. And so finally, I kind of thought about this. Every disaster to me is a learning lesson, and particularly those that impact us directly. And certainly this event had a huge impact on the public treasury. And it's funny, not funny, but it's interesting that, kind of the government will not really pony up the exact amount that this event did cost. But as I say, you put 2 and 2 together and you look at the downstream secondary impacts, it's certainly in the billions of dollars. And that's a terrible toll on our economy when it comes down to it. So, this is startling. Turns out that floodplains are dangerous places on which to live. I suppose that's why they're called floodplains. And we kind of have ignored that reality. We've allowed development to continue and increase and place people on floodplains that are normally safe 99.99% of the time, but it's that kind of one instant, that 0.01% where people are endangered and economic devastation occurs. So we should be thinking more about that. I mean, we're kind of the cows out of the barn, so to speak, because we currently have lots of infrastructure and lots of people living on floodplains, and we can't chase them off, in a society. We just wouldn't allow that. But they are exposed to a risk. And clearly, we need to do a better job of protecting the people and property that are already on floodplains. But the question arises, do we really want, or can we do this without, and still preserve the natural state of streams and rivers, which we value, and particularly, I know Burke Mountain naturalists value. So, hard infrastructure typically channelizes rivers. That's happened in Europe. There really is. Most of the rivers are not free flowing. They're corseted by dikes, and they're beautiful to look at, but they're not natural by any means. And we have still many rivers that are in a natural state that we really should be not sacrificing by confining them between dikes that are engineered. But it's not obvious to me how we can accomplish both protection and preservation of the natural states of streams and rivers when, as I say, the cow is out of the barn already. We already have so much infrastructure at risk. We clearly need to, kind of do a better job of protecting those people and the property that they own. And I don't want to take too much of a shot, but in my view, given what happened to our highways during this event, I think they're not properly designed for extreme atmospheric river events. They basically have been designed on the basis of those frequency magnitude diagrams, such as the one I showed you for the Fraser River. They look at the return periods of floods of particular size and kind of compromise. They design highways and rail lines for events that might occur once every 100 years or so, knowing that they're going to have to be replaced eventually. That would be reasonable if you had a stationary climate system, but we don't have a stationary climate system. Our climate is changing, and it really throws out a lot of, or at least compromises a lot of the meteorological data that's been collected under a different climate. So we have to anticipate now events that are more extreme than those that we've experienced historically, and that are probably going to be more frequent. Doesn't mean you're going to have, an event like 2021 over the next 5 years or maybe 10 years, but the likelihood of it happening is definitely increasing as our climate warms. And then I think it's always irritated me that we are a kind of a reactive society, and maybe that you can't blame the governments for that. People are reactive. We do a very good job in recovering from natural disasters, probably some of the best in the world at doing that. But we do a very poor job in being proactive in investing in critical infrastructure to reduce risk from extreme events. The one exception I would say is earthquakes. The provincial government has spent billions of dollars on improving critical infrastructure such that the inevitable impact of an earthquake is going to be much less than it would otherwise be. But we have not done that in the case of flooding. We haven't invested monies to improve the diking systems, the myriad of locally and municipally controlled dikes that exist in the Metro Vancouver area and up the valley. And yet, you could do an economic analysis, a simple cost-benefit analysis, given the $7.5 billion tag on this last disaster, it would really show the economic sense of doing this. So I often wonder why, and maybe it's, the collective representing us, the governments, operate on shorter timescales than the timescales that produce these disasters. The election cycles are 4 to 5 years, and I don't think governments are willing, given the kind of all the issues that they have to deal with. I don't deny that there are other very important issues, homelessness and the opioid crisis, but they seem to be reticent to spend money reducing the toll of these future disasters. And I just mentioned that in closing, that we can't rely on this assumption of climate stationarity, because the climate is changing kind of very rapidly, and kind of geological timescale, it's in a blink. We haven't seen a climate change so rapidly since the ice ages. We may not realize it, but in periods of decades, we're undergoing this huge, huge change. We've seen signs of it now, but it's only likely to get worse. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions if there's still time. I went a little bit over time, so I leave it to the hosts, Victoria and Ian, if they want to field some questions. I'm going to stop the share.
Yeah, we definitely have got time for questions. So I'll just start in the chat that I believe it was Lee Harding that said that he has photos of the North-South Thompson over their banks in the downtown Kamloops from last fall. So I don't know if
I was unaware of that. That's interesting.
Lee, do you have those photos handy that we could do a screen share?
Whoever is kind of made that comment, Lee Harding, I guess.
Yeah.
If you would share those, that would be fantastic. Because I was unaware. I mean, it surprised me the Fraser River down near, well, right in the lower Fraser Valley was quite high too. It didn't go to flood stage. It was very high, transporting huge amounts of woody debris and silt and clay into the Strait of Georgia.
So Lee, are you out there? Okay, we'll leave that one for now. And Philip just commented that the Evergreen Art Gallery had an exhibit about Sumas Lake this summer. It was a great exhibit. And I think there's a book about that as well that's supposed to be very good as well.
Yeah, there is. There's it's really interesting story, actually. I just kind of touched on it.
Right.
It's kind of a little bit of a colonization story, because the Stolo people, who live in that area were kind of totally ignored in the plan to drain the lake was formulated and kind of implemented.
And we do have a question. Since the current drought can enhance the risk of flooding when it starts raining again. How long does this affect us?
Again, yeah, it's interesting. There's concerns that the soil is hardened or less, will not absorb as much rainfall. I don't think, my personal view is that's not a huge issue. Having said that, it depends really on how intense the rainfall is. So I've been looking at the projections for rainfall over the last half of October. Admittedly, they're, when you get into these 10-day forecasts, there's a lot of uncertainty at the tail end of those. But, it's going to start raining late afternoon or evening on Friday. And thus far, it doesn't seem that the amounts are going to be particularly high. So I don't anticipate any flooding related to that. And then you get a break supposedly on Saturday, and then heavier rain on Monday and Tuesday. So I'm kind of looking at those as we get closer to see whether the intensity of rainfall is going to be, and the duration of rainfall is going to be large enough to cause flooding. Possibly, but you have to have rainfall totals of about 100 millimeters. That's the threshold at which you begin to experience significant flooding happening over a period of a day. So if they start saying, well, we're going to get 100 millimeters of rain on Monday, then I'm, going to say, well, it's pretty likely we're going to have a problem.
And what about landslides?
Landslides, same thing, although drought does kind of increase the possibility of landslides. And particularly, we know from the experience in California, Utah, Arizona, that areas that have been burned are particularly susceptible to what are called debris flows when it rains in the fall. And so we've burned, we've had a lot of forest land burned this summer. Even last year, I'm not sure that it's totally recovered enough that you wouldn't maybe expect to get debris flows if we had heavy rainfall. Again, small amounts of rain or typical fall rain probably aren't a problem. It's when you begin to exceed these thresholds, which we know are in that range of 80 to 100 millimeters that we have to worry. So that's my metric kind of. It's not perfect, but it gives you a sense for the amount of rain required to induce flooding and these debris flows.
And another question, what is your opinion of investing more in nature-based solutions to prevent flooding?
That's a good question. And it's kind of hard. I'm not sure what those nature-based solutions are. I know what they should be. You allow rivers more, the run of the river, larger area in which to escape their channel without damaging property. But that requires that you have the land to do that. And when I look at the lower Fraser Valley, the river's already diked. It's corseted, and it's a terrible situation because with that narrow kind of area that the water can flow through, you actually make the problem worse than it would be if you had a broader, wider floodplain with the dikes set back. And we didn't do that. We basically, well, I should say we didn't entirely do it. There's places out near Chilliwack where there's a fairly broad area that can be inundated without damage to infrastructure. But once you get below Chilliwack, it's basically a flume almost. The river is flowing between narrow dikes. And so I don't know how you can really achieve nature-based solutions when they've already been kind of compromised. You cannot sort of force people off their land, and society wouldn't tolerate that. So we're kind of stuck in many places with these hard engineered structures. That's my opinion. It's not shared by everybody, but I would say if there were an opportunity to do that, we should do it. We should look at kind of increasing the width of areas that can be flooded without damaging property.
Okay, for myself, I just look at the Sumas Prairie and think of that, you know, they drained it, drained the lake and started letting homes and things being built in the bottom of the lake, basically,
Yeah.
that they knew eventually would fill up again. So,
Yeah, you know, that's a frustration for me too. And I kind of empathize with the people on the prairie. You know, it is very productive. It produces, it's the best farmland probably in the province, except maybe the Fraser Delta. But it comes at a cost. And there's another comment here. Yeah, the Stolo were forced off their land. It's just one more story. And they had the knowledge that would have told us, if we were willing to listen, that this is not a very good place to kind of build houses and other infrastructure. But now it's been done. And I think we're wrestling with, well, how do we better protect that surface? Again, because it's kind of the cows out of the barn. We're having trouble with Washington. You know, big part of the problem is the Nooksack River. Well, that's in northern Washington. They're not particularly willing to address the problem we face. And they're First Nations issues because there still are salmon in the Nooksack River, the lower Nooksack River, and they're very important to the indigenous people down there on Lumi Island, I think. And so they don't want to see the river dredged or diked. They would prefer to leave it in a natural state. Yet that's going to ensure that you know, we have flooding not only on Sumas Prairie in the future without investing huge amounts of funds in engineered infrastructure, but also in Washington too. The communities bordering the Nooksack River on their side of the border are also flooded under these conditions. So it's an international issue, as it turns out. And I think the two governments, state government and the provincial government, are talking. There doesn't seem to be a plan in place to deal with the problem. Come up with some sort of maybe compromise solution.
it's just people talking about don't
Mother
mess with
Nature's
nature. Yeah, yeah,
Mother Nature always wins in the end.
yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, John, just verbally here? I found your point about trying to make plans for, you know, areas where 100-year flood is expected during a changing climate very chilling. Well, I think your whole talk was pretty, you know, sobering. Let's say sobering. Okay.
Yes. My wife calls me Dr. Doom.
Well, perhaps she has a point. Yes. Do you think there's enough data? Do we have enough data to revise these maps? I know, like along the Coquitlam River, there's maps of, you know, where 50-year flood, 100-year flood. Do we have enough data yet to revise those maps, just on a municipal level, even? Probably
not. You know, to be perfectly honest, we're kind of just going into this time of warmer climate, and we don't have enough data strung out over a long enough period to really kind of come up with robust, reliable estimates that allow us to change, you know, the frequency magnitude diagrams. And this is a kind of an issue that my professional association, Engineers and Geoscientists BC, wrestle with. You know, because basically engineers set the standards often for development. And you know, the professional organization is saying we have to take into account climate change. But what does that mean? You know, how conservative do you want to be? Because kind of typically taking that into account costs money. And there's a reluctance to spend more money than is absolutely necessary. So Victoria, I would say that we don't really, my guess is we don't have the data, but we need to be thinking about that. We can do it in terms of sea level rise. There's a better understanding of how fast sea level rise is going to be. And that's kind of an inevitable long-term problem. I call it a kind of a disaster playing out in slow-mo. But we have time to react to that. And the provincial government has made has issued advice to coastal municipalities to site new development up to a meter above its former levels, new development. So Vancouver has this as a municipal law that if you want to build along the shoreline in Vancouver, you have to build it higher than you would otherwise to accommodate, you know, a rise in sea level that would occur during the expected life span of that infrastructure. That's a positive step. It's a little more predictable than these storms, in my view, and it's a little more certain that we're going to be dealing with higher seas. And so I think we're in a better position to deal with that than we are with flooding or severe storms.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Doom.
Dr. Truth is what it is.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's reality.
Yeah, I try not to be too negative, you know, I mean,
No.
I try to be objective and, you know, kind of when you look at natural hazards, you can't help but my view is I'm kind of trying to imagine the black swans, you know, the things that we don't normally expect to happen that are likely to happen. And try to, you know, call attention to those, but without being, you know, overly pessimistic. But I do think we need to spend some money on improving our protective dikes. I really do. You know, I think that's should happen. Whether it's or not, I don't know.
Yeah, it's either protect the homes that are in there or get the homes out of there.
I mean,
so
they are doing that in parts of the U.S. They've got a federal agency that kind of sets the stage for doing these buyouts, and it's called FEMA, and it's Federal Emergency Management Association. It's a big bureaucratic organization, but they do in severe flood hazard situations try to buy properties to reduce the number of people that are exposed to flooding, which is a huge problem in the U.S. We don't have a FEMA.
Right. And there was just a couple of other comments about what other non-structural solutions to flooding that could be employed.
It's tricky. I mean, you can move, I suppose you might invest in protecting individual homes, but that gets pretty expensive when you have the amount of exposure there already is. You know, I'm hard pressed when you talk about rivers and streams to come up with anything other than structural solutions. Now, possibly there are some natural solutions that you know, might work that I haven't thought of. I think we need to at least stop new development on floodplains, you know, where there's a high level of risk. We can do that now, you know, through planning and land use regulations. Maybe we can't totally protect people that are already there, or it's difficult to protect them. But we shouldn't be, you know, allowing people to build in floodplains where we then have to step in and alter the river structural measures, because we all value natural streams and rivers. And we've got a lot of them still. We're not Europe. We've got a lot of natural streams and rivers that we should protect at all costs, you know, where there's very little property or people at risk.
Great. And Brian just had a comment about there are already Pacific Islands that are under severe threat, and I'd say that's to ocean rise, I guess, is what that's referring to.
Yeah, sea level rise is a problem. nother.
On a small scale, on an individual and municipal scale, I mean, people and also municipal governments could mandate a certain amount of pervious surface that needs to be considered when with new construction, with new residential development, not on a floodplain. And so there's an opportunity for the water to seep underground. But I mean, you'd have to do that on a greater Vancouver-wide strategy, and getting all the municipal governments to work together is another miracle. So, yeah, I mean, there's things we can do as individuals, but as far as non-structural from a more grander scale, like you, I don't know what that would entail, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't either. It's tricky, but I think awareness of this problem should allow us to try and not allow new development on floodplains. That's something we can challenge governments to do. I know there's economic pressures to allow development to continue on the Fraser River floodplain, but at least that's something that possibly could be impeded. I mean, we stopped, back in the early days of the environmental movement, they stopped the construction of that dam on the Fraser River at Pavilion. And some people would say that was impossible to do. And thank God we did it, because it protected salmon runs on the Fraser River. We don't have a dam on the main stream of the Fraser, thank God. And it came close to happening because BC Hydro was hell-bent on putting a dam in there north of Lillooet. But there was enough pushback by citizens that they backed off on it. So there's always hope.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks so much, John. Fabulous. Again, always incredible. It would be great to see how the numbers of people watch this multiple times and that. So
yeah, well, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Great.
I always enjoy speaking to your group and other groups that are really concerned about the natural environment. It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks very, very much.
So maybe we'll switch to if anybody's got any wildlife sightings over the last month or so.
I haven't received any, so I don't have anything.
You don't have any photos, no?
Don't have any photos to contribute from the game. But
now, the Teesons still online here? Oh, there we are. Yeah, they're still here. Oh. So does anybody have any wildlife sightings?
Oh, well, sure. The chummer back in the Coquitlam River, and so this morning I saw about 20 off the beach near my place, spawning pairs, and the females on their sides making the reds. And there's lots of patches of clean gravel where the salmon have spawned freshly. So,
and that's near the David Bridge crossing.
Yeah, that's just downstream from the David Avenue Bridge, but they're all up and down the river.
Great. But have you seen any coming up into the smaller creeks off the river?
No, not yet. The creeks are just so incredibly low. The river's still low. Hopefully the water will come up with this rain, and hydro will let a little more water out. But yeah, the creeks are very low.
Ian, why don't you? I just recalled. Why don't you tell everybody about the little passenger who nearly hitched a ride in your truck on Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, we were funny enough. We were driving on a logging road about 25 kilometers east of Squamish, and grouse are famous for waiting until you're a few feet from them before they decide to fly in. But anyway, this particular one must have been along the side of the road, and as I drove by, it flew up parallel to the truck and was within inches of coming in my window if I would have had it open. So that was a little close experience. The other thing, and I haven't checked on this, but I was getting out of my vehicle at work in Surrey-Langley border, and I could hear a bit of squawking up in the air. So I looked up and I saw these birds, forming a V, but they were white and very, very little noise coming from them. But I thought, well, what is that? Stupidly, I couldn't think of it at the time. And then it was later, I thought that they were possibly snow geese. So maybe I'll just throw that out to people if snow geese also fly in the V shape. If anybody knows, I haven't looked it up yet, but that was my thought on it. It was like geese, but they were white. So
I'm hesitating to say anything in case Larry's on the call here.
Larry was on earlier. I don't know if he's
Yeah.
still on.
If he's
so.
not here, I'll talk. Sure.
Okay, you
Yeah.
talk, and then
Yeah, they're back. They're back,
Okay.
and I'm sure they fly in V's as
Okay.
well. Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to say, I think Phil Buchan had his hand up if he's still on the call.
Oh,
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I saw a coyote in my back alley on Howie Avenue, and my dog was barking at it when we were taking a walk last night. We have
Is
a
this-
neighborhood coyote.
Wow. And is this a little dog we're looking at?
Yeah, that's him. Yeah.
Oh, wouldn't stand a chance.
Ferocious beast.
yeah. So that's around
Yeah.
Blue Mountain Park, if people are not familiar with that. So thanks for sharing, Phil.
Actually, Ian, I can add a little story. Linda here.
Sure.
Last night, actually, we were just out for a walk. I'm south of Mundy Park. So we were just out walking along King Albert. And husband spotted something. He says, "Oh, is that a dog up there?" We focus. No, it's a coyote. So we see one. Well, I'm sort of going, well, let's just head to a house right now. And then we keep walking and we spot another coyote just a little bit further down the road. So now I'm thinking, great, we got one on either side of us. So fortunately, they do respond well to clapping of hands and disappeared, but probably into someone's backyard and into the Mundy Park, because that was on that side.
Yeah.
But I was surprised actually to see them out at that time. It was only maybe 8:30 at night. So
8:30, but dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
I
Yeah.
think that's pretty usual in my experience anyway. So
Well, okay, let's say first time.
yeah,
Here
no, that's
for a number of years.
okay.
I'd just like to relate a story about a coyote. We were walking at the Mobile Slough about 3-4 weeks ago, and we noticed a coyote off in the center of the slough bounding. And we walked further down the trail. It was Jeff, myself, and Edie. And it came up onto the dike. And then it came towards us, and it actually passed. We backed off to the one side of the trail, and it passed us on the other side of the trail, on the other side of the dike, and took off and then kept going.
Wow. Fearless.
Interesting. I have some photographs of it too. Hey, Jeff, you remember that?
I've got a video of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was quite something because he was a little bit tentative. He'd sort of come towards us, stop, back off, come towards us, back off, and then finally got his nerve up and zipped by.
But no one was lunging at him, so he figured he could outrun you guys.
Probably passed within 3 feet of each other.
Gosh.
It's amazing. You know, I haven't seen any red foxes since I started seeing coyotes. Back in the 60s and the 70s, used to see the occasional red fox in the Lower Mainland. And about the same time, I started seeing coyotes. And then I don't know if it was a combination of the red foxes being less tolerant of human intervention and coyotes being more tolerant, or the competition for small animals.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know of any spottings of foxes at all, so I'm not sure what the habitat, because even in wild areas and that, I don't hear about it. So
Ian, did you see Jim's note?
yeah, yes, I know. So he's having a problem with the audio, so we'll do that another time, or at the year-end slideshow. So
Cool.
any other wildlife settings? Okay, hearing that, I think not unless if anybody wants to say anything, they can speak up. Hearing nothing.
The Friends of the Mobile Slough have a Zoom meeting scheduled for the 27th
Of this month.
of this month.
Right.
I just like to let people know that it's a committee of the BMN, so we want to invite as many BMNers as possible.
Right. And actually, just one thing while I think about it, for those of you that know Frank Nick, he passed away at the beginning of the month. He was 91, and they had his memorial service or mass today, and I attended that. But the family is in lieu of flowers. They've actually not only the Terry Fox Foundation, but they've added the Burke Mountain Naturalists as a society for people to donate to in lieu of flowers. So I thought that was quite nice. So Frank was a very good friend of mine, and did a lot of hiking and that with him, and he's done a lot for BMN. And in the future, I hope to do a show and share about Frank and what he did for BMN.
That would be great, Ian.
Well, we'll bring the meeting to a close. So thanks everybody for coming out, and especially if I don't know if John's still online, but thanks to him again for a great presentation. And keep your photos for wildlife sightings, and we can have them for next month. So thanks very much, and have a good night. And if any of the
just one last, sorry,
okay.
one last. David, do you have the Zoom meeting set up yet for the Friends of the Mobile Slough committee meeting?
I do.
Okay. Can we distribute that to all the members? So that
You can. I will email it to you.
thank you. I'll send it out to all the members. So,
Okay,
yep.
great. Thanks.
No problem at all.
Okay. And if the executive want to stick around afterwards, they can. Great. Have a
Okay.
good night.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Ian.
Thanks, everybody.
And Brian. Yeah, good.
And then we're 5.
Yes, and then